Three men rode into the Mojave with stolen gold and never came back. No bodies were found, no tracks led anywhere. The money vanished with them. For weeks afterward, searchers combed the sand and stone, but the desert offered nothing, not a bone, not a coin, not even a story that made sense. It was as if the earth had simply opened and swallowed them whole. But the desert doesn't hide things forever. It holds them, and sometimes, years later, it gives back only questions. What happened out there in the heat and silence has never been answered, but the days before they rode out tell a different story. One about choices made in shadows, about men who believed they could outrun their pasts, about a town that watched them leave and wondered even then if they were riding toward freedom or something far worse. This is what came before the disappearance, before the desert kept its secret. The town of Caliente sat low in the San Joaquin Valley, a collection of sun-bleached wood and cracked adobe that seemed to shrink a little more each summer. It was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better. The railroad had promised prosperity, but the tracks curved north, missing Caliente by 15 miles, and with them went the future. What remained were dust and stubbornness, a handful of families too tired to leave, and a saloon that opened at noon and closed when the last man fell asleep at the bar. In the spring of 1882, 3 men arrived in Caliente within days of each other. They came separately, but it didn't take long before they began moving in the same orbits, like planets drawn by an unseen gravity. The first was a man named Garrett Cole, tall and lean with a face that looked like it had been carved by hard years. He wore a long coat even in the heat and kept his hat pulled low. He took a room above the general store and paid 2 weeks in advance with silver coins that looked freshly minted. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice carried the soft drawl of Texas. The second man called himself William Fairchild, though there were some who doubted that was the name he was born with. He was younger than Cole, maybe 30, with a quick smile and hands that were never quite still. He played cards at the saloon most evenings and won just enough to buy drinks, but not enough to make enemies. He wore a vest with a watch chain that glinted in the lamplight, and he laughed often, though his eyes stayed watchful. The third was a Mexican man named Esteban Ruiz. He was quiet in a different way than Cole, the kind of quiet that came from seeing too much. He worked odd jobs around town, mending fences, hauling freight, fixing a broken wagon wheel for the blacksmith. He was good with his hands and better with horses. People liked him, though no one really knew him. He slept in the livery stable and kept to himself, and when someone asked where he'd come from, he just said south and let the silence do the rest. By late April, the 3 men were spending time together. It was subtle at first. A shared table at the saloon, a conversation in the alley behind the stable, a ride out toward the foothills that lasted all afternoon. No one thought much of it. Caliente was too small and too hot for gossip to take root, and besides, men drifting through the West often found each other, drawn by shared silences or shared sins. It was the way of things, but there were people who noticed. Sarah Calloway, who ran the general store with her husband, watched Garrett Cole from behind the counter and saw the way his eyes tracked movement on the street, the way he always sat facing the door. She mentioned it once to her husband, and he shrugged and said the man was probably running from something. Most men out here were. Marshal Tom Bridger noticed too. He was an older man, graying and slow but not blind. He saw the way the 3 men moved together, the way they spoke in low voices and stopped talking when someone came near. He didn't have cause to question them, but he made a point to walk past the saloon more often, to nod at them when they crossed paths, to let them know he was watching. Not because he thought they were planning trouble, but because in a town like Caliente, trouble was always one bad decision away. Then on the 1st of May, the stage from Bakersfield came through carrying a payroll for the mining company up in the hills. It was a small shipment, maybe $2,000 in gold and paper currency. But in a place like Caliente, That kind of money was a small fortune. The stage stopped long enough for the driver to water the horses and for the guard to stretch his legs, and then it rolled on, heading east toward the desert road. It never made it to the mines. The driver and the guard were found the next morning, 6 miles outside of town, sitting by the side of the road, with their hands tied and their mouths dry. They weren't hurt, not badly, just shaken and angry and embarrassed. They said 3 men had come out of the rocks just after dawn, masked and armed, and had taken the strongbox without firing a shot. The whole thing had been calm, almost polite. One of the men had even apologized before riding off. The driver described them as professional. The guard said they moved like they'd done it before. Marshal Bridger rode out to the site with 2 men from town. They found the tracks easily enough, 3 horses heading south and east toward the Mojave. The trail was clear for the first few miles, and then it began to break apart, scattered by wind and stone. Bridger followed as far as he could, but by midday the heat was crushing and the tracks had vanished into hardpan and sand. He turned back, knowing that without more men and more water, there was no point in pushing further. Back in Caliente, word of the robbery spread fast. The mining company sent an angry telegram to the county seat demanding action. The stage company offered a reward, and people began to talk. It didn't take long before someone mentioned the 3 strangers. Someone else remembered seeing them ride out early that morning before dawn. Another recalled that Garrett Cole had asked about the stage schedule a week earlier, casual-like, as if he were just making conversation. The pieces didn't prove anything, but they fit together too neatly to ignore. Marshal Bridger went to the rooms where the men had been staying. Cole's room was empty, his belongings gone. Fairchild's room at the boarding house was the same. The livery owner said Esteban Ruiz had saddled his horse before sunrise and ridden out without a word. All 3 men had left within hours of each other, and none of them had come back. Bridger sent word to the surrounding towns and posted notices at every crossroads within 2 days' ride. He wired the marshal in Bakersfield and the sheriff in Mojave. He did everything he could with the resources he had. But deep down, he knew it was probably too late. The desert was vast and unforgiving, and men who knew how to disappear could stay gone for a long time. Still, something about it didn't sit right with him. The robbery had been clean, almost gentle. No one had been hurt. The robbers hadn't taken the horses or the men's personal belongings, and the way they'd vanished afterward, it was too deliberate, too planned. It felt less like a desperate crime and more like a carefully measured risk, like men who believed they had thought of everything. What Bridger didn't know, what no one in Caliente knew, was that the 3 men had been planning the robbery for weeks. They had met months earlier in a town further south, brought together by circumstance and necessity, and they had recognized in each other something that didn't need to be spoken aloud. They were men who had made mistakes, who carried debts they couldn't pay, who had burned bridges behind them and had nowhere left to go but forward. Garrett Cole had been a lawman once, back in Texas, but he'd killed a man in a situation that wasn't as clear-cut as the law required, and he'd left before the questions became accusations. He'd been drifting ever since, looking for a place where his past didn't follow him. The money from the robbery was supposed to buy him that place, somewhere quiet where he could start over without looking over his shoulder. William Fairchild had been a gambler and a con man, charming and quick, but he'd cheated the wrong man in a game in San Francisco, and that man had friends who didn't forgive. Fairchild had been running for a year, moving from town to town, always one step ahead of a reckoning he knew was coming. The gold was his way out, a ticket to Mexico or South America, somewhere far enough that the past couldn't reach. Esteban Ruiz had fought in wars that didn't concern him and had lost everything that mattered. His family was gone, his land taken, his name erased by forces he couldn't fight. He had nothing left but his skill and his silence, and he had agreed to the robbery not because he wanted wealth, but because he no longer feared consequence. The money was a means, not an end. What he wanted was distance. They had chosen Caliente because it was small and remote, because the stage route was predictable, and because no one would expect three strangers to work together so seamlessly. They had watched and waited and planned every detail, and when the morning came, they had executed the robbery exactly as they'd rehearsed. But planning only takes you so far. The desert has its own rules. They rode hard after the robbery, pushing their horses southeast into the empty country where the land turned from scrub to sand. They carried enough water for 3 days and enough food for 4. The plan was to reach a small settlement near the Colorado River, sell the horses, and disappear into Arizona. From there, they would split the money and go their separate ways. It was simple. It was supposed to work. The first day went smoothly. They covered 20 miles by midday and found shade in a canyon where a trickle of water still ran. They rested the horses and ate cold beans from a tin. Fairchild joked about what he would do with his share, spinning fantasies about fine hotels and better cards. Ruiz said nothing, just checked his saddle and watched the sky. Cole studied the map, tracing their route with a calloused finger, calculating time and distance. They set out again in the late afternoon, riding into the long shadows. The heat began to ease, and the air smelled of dust and creosote. The land stretched flat and empty in every direction, broken only by low mesas and the occasional Joshua tree standing like a sentinel. It was beautiful in a harsh way, the kind of beauty that made men feel small. By nightfall they made camp in the open, too far from anywhere to worry about being seen. They didn't light a fire. They ate jerky and stale bread and passed a canteen between them. Fairchild asked Cole if he thought anyone would follow them this far. Cole said no, not without a posse, and no town that size had the men or the money to organize one. Ruiz agreed. He said the desert would do their work for them, that anyone who came looking would turn back before they got close. They slept in shifts, each man taking 2 hours to watch while the others rested. The night was cold and clear, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional cry of a coyote or the soft rustle of something moving through the brush. When morning came, they saddled up and rode on. But by midday on the second day, something had changed. The heat was worse than they'd expected, climbing past 100 degrees with no clouds to break it. The horses were tiring faster, their breathing labored. The water was going quicker than planned. Cole suggested they rest until evening, but Fairchild argued they needed to keep moving, that they were too exposed if anyone was tracking them. Ruiz sided with Cole, and they stopped in the thin shade of an outcrop, waiting for the worst of the heat to pass. It was then that Fairchild noticed his canteen was nearly empty. He accused Ruiz of drinking more than his share. Ruiz denied it calmly, but there was an edge in his voice. Cole stepped between them and said it didn't matter, that they'd find water soon. But the tension didn't dissipate. It hung in the air like the heat, thick and pressing. They rode on at dusk, following the map toward a dry lake bed that Cole said would lead them to a spring. But when they reached the lake bed, it was just cracked earth and salt, stretching for miles. The spring was gone, or had never been there, or had been marked wrong on the map. They stood at the edge of the emptiness and looked at each other, and no one said what they were all thinking. They made camp without speaking. The mood had shifted, the easy camaraderie of the first day replaced by something colder. Fairchild sat apart, checking his revolver. Ruiz lay on his back, staring at the stars. Cole paced, thinking through their options, calculating how far they could push the horses, how long the water would last. In the middle of the night, during Fairchild's watch, he thought he saw something moving in the distance. A shape, low and dark, slipping between the dunes. He called out softly, and the others woke. They watched together, but the shape didn't reappear. Fairchild insisted it had been there. Cole said it was probably an animal. Ruiz said nothing, but his hand rested on his rifle. When dawn came, they found tracks in the sand near their camp. Not horse tracks, human, barefoot, leading away into the desert and then disappearing as if whoever had made them had simply lifted off the ground. No one spoke about it. They packed in silence and mounted their horses and rode on, faster now, driven by something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it. By the third day, the water was almost gone. Part 2. The Silence and the Hunt. The days after the robbery moved slowly in Caliente, each one bleeding into the next under the relentless sun. The town had never been prosperous, but now it carried the weight of something heavier than poverty. It felt like failure. The stage company stopped routing through Caliente altogether, rerouting their line 15 miles north where the terrain was harder, but the memories weren't so fresh. The mining company sent angry letters demanding restitution that the town couldn't provide. And Marshal Tom Bridger aged 10 years in the span of a month, the lines around his eyes deepening as he stared at maps that offered no answers. Sarah Calloway stopped sleeping well. She would wake in the early hours and stand at her bedroom window, looking out at the empty street, thinking about Garrett Cole and the way he had counted out those silver coins so carefully, as if he had been preparing even then. Her husband told her to let it go, that the men were gone and good riddance, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she should have seen something, should have said something. The thought turned in her mind like a key that wouldn't quite catch. The driver and guard from the stage left town within a week, tired of the questions and the looks. People wanted someone to blame, and when the actual culprits were beyond reach, the two men who had let themselves be robbed without resistance became convenient targets. Before they departed, the guard told Bridger something he hadn't mentioned in his initial statement. He said one of the masked men, the tall one, had spoken to him while they tied his hands, had told him in a quiet voice that no harm would come to him if he stayed calm. The guard said there had been something almost apologetic in the tone, something that suggested the robbery wasn't personal, just necessary. Bridger filed the detail away, though he wasn't sure what good it did him. The reward notices went up throughout the county, crude ink sketches based on descriptions from the townspeople. Garrett Cole, with his long coat and Texas drawl. William Fairchild, with his quick smile and restless hands. Esteban Ruiz, with his quiet competence and southern origins. The descriptions were vague enough to fit 100 men drifting through the territory, and within weeks the notices were faded and torn, flapping uselessly in the wind. Marshal Bridger organized 2 search parties in those first weeks. The first rode out with 6 men, following the track southeast into the Mojave until the trail went cold at the edge of a dry lake bed. They found nothing but emptiness, the kind that made men question why they had come at all. The second party, smaller and less enthusiastic, pushed further east, hoping to cut across the fugitives' path or find some sign of their passage. They returned 5 days later, sunburned and defeated, reporting only endless sand and the bleached bones of animals that had tried and failed to cross that merciless landscape. After that, the official search ended. There was no budget for more. The county seat made sympathetic noises but sent no additional resources. The federal marshals had larger concerns, and 3 men who had stolen $2,000 weren't worth the manpower it would take to comb the desert. Bridger was told to keep the case open, to follow up on any leads that emerged. But everyone understood what that meant. The case was dead. The men were either dead too, or so far gone that they might as well be. But the case didn't die in the way cases usually did, fading quietly into the past. Instead, it festered. It became the thing people talked about when the work was done and the whiskey was poured. It became the story that defined that summer, and then that year, and eventually the town itself. Caliente became the place where 3 men had vanished into the desert with stolen gold, and no one knew what had happened to them. The theories multiplied like weeds. Some said the men had made it through the desert and were living high in Mexico, drinking tequila and laughing about the fools they'd left behind. Others said they'd killed each other over the money, that greed had turned to violence somewhere in the dunes, and their bones were scattered where no one would ever find them, A traveling preacher passing through in July declared it was divine retribution, that God had struck them down for their sins and left no trace as a warning to others. That version found favor with the more religious families, though it didn't comfort them any. There were sightings, of course. That autumn, a rancher 20 miles south swore he'd seen 3 men riding hard across his property at dawn, their saddlebags heavy. Bridger rode out to investigate but found no tracks, no evidence, nothing to support the claim. The rancher was elderly and half-blind, and Bridger suspected he'd seen wild horses and let his imagination fill in the rest. In December, a prospector came into town claiming he'd found a campsite in the foothills with fresh ashes and 3 sets of boot prints. Bridger went out again, and again found nothing. The ashes were weeks old, the prints inconclusive. The prospector admitted he'd been drinking. By the spring of 1883, a year after the robbery, the sightings had taken on a desperate quality. People wanted to believe the men were still out there, not because they wanted them caught, but because the alternative was too empty. If the men were dead, if the desert had swallowed them without ceremony or trace, then there was no justice, no resolution, no meaning to any of it. Just 3 lives ended badly and $2,000 lost to the sand. That kind of emptiness was harder to accept than mystery. Sarah Calloway found herself thinking about the men more than she wanted to admit. She wondered if they had families somewhere, people who were waiting for word that would never come. She wondered if they had regretted the robbery once they were out in the heat, if they had wished they could turn back, but pride or fear had kept them moving forward. She mentioned these thoughts once to her husband, and he told her she was being foolish, that men like that didn't deserve sympathy. But she couldn't help it. They had been real people walking through her store, and now they were gone, and the not knowing felt like a weight she couldn't put down. Marshal Bridger took to riding out into the desert alone, not on any official search, but because he couldn't seem to let it go. He would pack water and hardtack and ride southeast for a day, following old trails and dry washes, looking for something he couldn't name. He never found anything. The desert offered him the same indifference it offered everyone, endless and silent. But the rides gave him a strange kind of peace, as if the act of looking mattered more than what he found. The town changed in small ways. The saloon's clientele grew quieter, less inclined to laughter. Families pulled their children a little closer, as if the disappearance had reminded them how fragile everything was. The general store did less business, and Sarah Calloway took to extending credit more often, knowing that people were struggling and that kindness cost less than she thought. Her husband complained, but she kept doing it anyway. The seasons turned. Summer heat gave way to autumn chill, and then winter rains that left the streets muddy and the air heavy. Spring came again, bringing wildflowers to the foothills and a brief sense of renewal. And then summer returned, hotter than before, and the cycle continued. Time moved forward whether people were ready or not. By 1884, 2 years gone, the robbery had become local legend. Newcomers to Caliente heard the story from the old-timers, usually in the saloon, usually late at night. The details shifted depending on who was telling it. In some versions, the 3 men had been cold-blooded killers, ruthless and cunning. In others, they were desperate souls pushed to crime by circumstances beyond their control. The truth, whatever it had been, was buried under layers of speculation and whiskey. A traveling journalist came through in the summer of that year, researching stories of the frontier for a newspaper back east. He interviewed Marshal Bridger, Sarah Calloway, and a half-dozen others, taking notes in a leather-bound journal. He seemed particularly interested in the lack of evidence, the way the men had simply vanished. He asked if Bridger thought they were still alive. Bridger hesitated, then said he didn't know. The journalist pressed him, wanting a more definitive answer, something dramatic for his readers. Bridger finally said that the desert keeps its secrets, and that was the only truth he could offer. The journalist left disappointed, though he published the story anyway. embellishing it with details that made the men sound more dangerous and the desert more mythic than either had been. The article brought a brief flurry of attention. Treasure hunters showed up in Caliente, convinced they could find the lost gold where others had failed. They bought supplies from the general store, asked endless questions, and rode out with grand ambitions. Most came back within a few days, humbled by the heat and the emptiness. A few didn't come back at all, and their disappearances added to the desert's grim reputation. Marshal Bridger started refusing to organize rescue parties, telling people plainly that if they were fool enough to go out unprepared, they would have to face the consequences. It was harsh, but the town didn't have the resources to keep saving people from their own recklessness. Sarah Calloway's husband died in 1885, his heart giving out one afternoon while he was unloading freight. She buried him in the small cemetery on the edge of town and took over running the store by herself. People worried she wouldn't manage, but she proved more capable than anyone expected, keeping the books balanced and the shelves stocked. She still thought about Garrett Cole sometimes, though less often now. The memory had softened, becoming less about the man and more about that strange spring when everything had seemed poised on the edge of change. Marshal Bridger retired in 1886, his knees too stiff and his eyes too weak to keep up with the demands of the job. The county appointed a younger man to replace him, someone who had never known the three fugitives and had no investment in their story. Bridger stayed in Caliente, living in a small house near the church, and he spent his days carving wood and thinking about the cases he'd never solved. The robbery was always the one that bothered him most. Not because it had been particularly violent or clever, but because there had been no ending, just a question mark that stretched across years. The legend continued to grow. By the late 1880s, children in Caliente played games inspired by the robbery, pretending to be outlaws fleeing into the desert or lawmen giving chase. The adults found it unsettling, this transformation of real people and real crimes into childhood fantasy, but they didn't stop it. Maybe it was easier to let the story become myth than to keep carrying the weight of its reality. There were still occasional sightings, though less frequent now. A shepherder in 1887 claimed to have seen a man matching Garrett Cole's description in a town near the Mexican border, but when the new marshal followed up, he found nothing. A woman in 1889 swore William Fairchild had dealt her cards in a gambling house in Arizona, but she couldn't produce any proof beyond her certainty. These reports were filed away, noted but not pursued. The case had become a ghost, haunting the edges of official records without ever being resolved. By the 1890s, most of the people who had known the three men personally were gone or scattered. Sarah Calloway was still in Caliente, older and grayer, but still running the store. She had become something of a keeper of the town's history, and visitors sometimes asked her about the robbery. She would tell the story plainly, without embellishment, describing the men as they had been, not as legend had made them. She always ended by saying she hoped they had made it, that they had found whatever they were looking for. People found that strange, this sympathy for thieves, but she didn't care. They had been human, and that mattered. The turn of the century came and went. Caliente shrank further, the young people leaving for cities where there were jobs and futures. The saloon closed. The church held services only twice a month. The general store stayed open, though Sarah hired help now, her hands too arthritic to manage everything alone. She was in her 60s, and she sometimes wondered if she would die without ever knowing what had happened to those three men who had ridden into the desert in the spring of 1882. Marshal Bridger passed away in 1903, pneumonia taking him quickly. At his funeral, the new marshal, now not so new anymore, mentioned the robbery case in his eulogy, calling it Tom Bridger's greatest frustration and his most enduring mystery. The words hung in the small church, and afterward people stood in the cemetery and talked about the old days, about how things had been different once, though none of them could quite articulate how. The years continued their march. The case file, what little there was of it, sat in a wooden cabinet in the marshal's office, gathering dust. Occasionally someone would ask about it, usually a historian or a writer drawn by the legend, and they would be allowed to look through the sparse pages. There was never much to see. A few witness statements, some correspondence with other jurisdictions, a description of the crime. No photographs, no physical evidence, nothing that brought the story to life beyond words on yellowing paper. By the 1920s, Caliente was barely a town at all, just a handful of buildings and a few stubborn residents who refused to leave. The general store had finally closed in 1918 after Sarah Calloway died peacefully in her sleep. The marshal's office was unmanned, the position eliminated due to lack of need. The files were transferred to the county seat, boxed up and stored in a basement archive where they joined thousands of other forgotten cases from a frontier that no longer existed. The story of the three vanished outlaws became the kind of tale old-timers told to pass the time, each retelling stripping away a little more detail until only the skeleton remained. 3 men, a robbery, the desert, disappearance. It could have happened anywhere, to anyone. The specifics ceased to matter. And then, in the autumn of 1964, 82 years after the robbery, a pair of hikers found something in the Mojave. They were young college students from Los Angeles looking for adventure, and they had driven out to the desert with camping gear and a sense of invincibility. They hiked into a remote canyon, following a dry wash between red rock walls. And there, tucked beneath an overhang, where the sand had drifted and settled, they found a leather saddlebag. It was cracked and faded, the buckles rusted but intact. Inside were items that should have disintegrated decades ago, but had been preserved by the dryness. A bundle of letters tied with string, a pocket watch with an engraved case, a folding knife, and a small leather-bound journal with pages still legible. The hikers brought their find to the nearest ranger station, not sure what they had, but sensing it was significant. The ranger, an older man who had lived in the region his whole life, recognized the name engraved on the pocket watch: William Fairchild. The discovery made regional news, then national. Historians and journalists descended on the area, suddenly interested in a crime that had been forgotten by everyone except a few elderly residents of a ghost town. The journal was turned over to the county archives, and a retired professor of Western history was brought in to examine it. The journal had belonged to Garrett Cole, and its pages told a story that no one had expected. It described the planning of the robbery, the execution, and then the journey into the desert. The entries grew shorter as the days passed, the handwriting more erratic. Water had run out. One of the horses had gone lame. They had become lost, the map proving unreliable. Arguments had started, accusations exchanged, but there was no violence described, no betrayal. Just men slowly realizing they had made a fatal miscalculation. The final entry was dated 4 days after the robbery. It was brief, written in a shaky hand. Water gone, horse dead. William talking to himself. Esteban quiet. I think this is the end. We thought we could make it. We were wrong. The discovery reignited interest in the case, but it brought no bodies, no gold, no closure. Just evidence that 3 men had died slowly in the desert, probably within miles of where the saddlebag was found, their remains scattered by wind and animals and time until nothing recognizable was left. The county organized a search of the area using modern equipment and trained volunteers. They found a few more artifacts over the following weeks: scraps of cloth, a rusted canteen, a horseshoe, but no human remains, no money. The desert had kept its secret after all, giving back only fragments, only enough to confirm what people had long suspected. The journal was copied and archived, made available to researchers. It became a primary source document, studied in universities, referenced in books about the Old West. The story of the 3 outlaws was no longer legend, but history, grounded in the written words of a man who had lived it. In Caliente, which by then was truly a ghost town, nothing remained but crumbling walls and memories held by no one. But the story lived on, transformed by time and evidence into something both more real and more tragic than the myths had ever been. 3 men had made a choice, had believed they could outrun their pasts, and had died for that belief in the unforgiving emptiness of the Mojave. The gold was never found. Some thought it had been buried, hidden by men too weak to carry it further. Others believed it had been lost, dropped, or scattered in the confusion of dying. A few romantics insisted it was still out there, waiting beneath the sand for someone lucky or persistent enough to find it. But most people, reading the journal and understanding the desperation in those final words, realized the truth was simpler and sadder. The gold didn't matter. It had never mattered. 3 men had died chasing an idea of freedom that the desert had no interest in granting them. That was the only story worth telling. Part 3. The truth and the legacy. The discovery of the journal changed nothing and everything at the same time. The facts were settled now, confirmed by Garrett Cole's own hand. 3 men had ridden into the desert with stolen gold and died there, victims of their own miscalculation and the unforgiving landscape. The mystery that had defined Caliente for decades was resolved in the most mundane way possible, not through dramatic confrontation or supernatural intervention, but through simple human error. They had trusted a bad map, underestimated the heat, and paid the ultimate price. Yet somehow the story felt less finished than before. The professor who had examined the journal, a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, spent months researching the lives of the 3 men before the robbery. She traveled to archives across the West, following paper trails that had grown cold generations earlier. What she found surprised her. Garrett Cole had indeed been a lawman in Texas, just as people had suspected. But the killing that drove him west hadn't been the act of a corrupt or violent man. He had shot a rancher's son who was beating a Mexican worker to death, and the rancher had enough influence to ensure that Cole's badge wouldn't protect him. Cole had left not to escape justice, but to escape a system that valued power over truth. Dr. Hartwell found a letter he had written to his sister, never sent, tucked between the pages of an old legal document. In it, he explained what had happened and why he couldn't come home. The letter ended with a line that stayed with her. "I did the right thing, but doing right cost me everything I was." William Fairchild's past was harder to trace, his real name buried under layers of aliases and reinvention. But eventually, she found a notice in a San Francisco newspaper from 1881, describing a gambling dispute that had turned deadly. A man had been killed, and Fairchild had been there, though whether he'd pulled the trigger or simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time was unclear. The victim's family had sworn vengeance, and Fairchild had disappeared the next day. What struck Dr. Hartwell was a detail in the article. Fairchild had tried to stop the fight, had called for calm, and had been ignored. He had been running not from what he'd done, but from what others believed he'd done. Truth and perception weren't the same thing, and perception could kill you just as dead. Esteban Ruiz proved the hardest to research, his history fragmented by language barriers and the casual erasure of Mexican lives from official records. But Dr. Hartwell was persistent. She found a land grant dispute in Southern California, a family named Ruiz that had lost their property in a legal battle they never had the resources to fight. She found a death certificate for a woman and 2 children, victims of fever in the winter of 1879, and she found a single photograph, faded and cracked, of a man who might have been Esteban, standing beside a woman who might have been his wife, both of them young and smiling in a moment before loss had hollowed them out. There was no documentation of what he'd done after his family died, just a gap of years before he appeared in Caliente. Dr. Hartwell believed he had fought in range wars, had hired his skills out to whoever would pay, not because he believed in any cause, but because moving forward was easier than standing still with grief. She compiled her findings into a book published in 1968 titled The Caliente Outlaws: 3 Lives and 1 Mistake. It was not a sensational work, despite pressure from her publisher to dramatize the story. Instead, she wrote with quiet empathy about men who had been shaped by forces beyond their control, who had made a single desperate choice and been destroyed by it. The book sold modestly, but was praised by historians for its thoroughness and humanity. It brought the story of the robbery back into public consciousness, not as legend, but as history, grounded in the messy reality of lives lived on the margins. For the few remaining people who remembered the original events, the book was a strange gift. It gave names and context to men who had been reduced to caricatures over the decades. It made them human again. There was one person still living who had known the 3 men personally. Her name was Rosa Mendoza, and she was 93 years old in 1968, living in a care facility in Bakersfield. She had been a girl in Caliente during the spring of 1882, the daughter of the livery owner who had rented space to Esteban Ruiz. When Dr. Hartwell tracked her down and asked if she remembered him, Rosa's eyes had brightened with recognition. "He was kind," she said in Spanish, her voice thin but certain. "He fixed my doll once when the arm came off. My father said not to bother him, but he saw me crying and took it and carved a new peg and fitted it so carefully. He didn't have to do that, but he did." Dr. Hartwell asked if Rosa had been afraid of him, if she'd thought he was dangerous. Rosa shook her head slowly. "I was a child. I didn't know what dangerous meant, but I knew sadness. He carried it like a weight. Even when he smiled, you could see it." She paused, looking out the window at the flat expanse of the San Joaquin Valley. So different from the Mojave, but still touched by the same merciless sun. "When they said he'd robbed the stage and disappeared, I didn't want to believe it. But my father said that sad men do sad things, and maybe this was his way of trying to stop being sad. I think about that sometimes, whether it worked, even for a little while. Whether he felt free out there in the desert before the end." Dr. Hartwell included Rosa's words in the book, and they became one of the most quoted passages. There was something in that image, of a man fixing a child's doll with careful hands, that humanized Esteban Ruiz in a way that facts alone could not. The publication of the book brought another wave of attention to the site where the saddlebag had been found. The Bureau of Land Management designated it a historical location, installing a small marker that told the story in brief, factual terms. Visitors came, though not in large numbers. The site was remote and difficult to reach, requiring hours of driving on rough roads, followed by a hike through terrain that was still unforgiving. But those who made the journey often left flowers or coins or small tokens, a wordless acknowledgement of lives that had ended there. A filmmaker tried to make a movie about the robbery in the 1970s, drawn by the dramatic arc and the mystery. He optioned Dr. Hartwell's book and hired a screenwriter, but the project stalled in development. The problem, the director admitted in an interview, was that the story didn't fit the expected mold. There was no villain, no hero, no redemptive ending. Just 3 men who had made a mistake and died for it. Audiences wanted more, and he didn't know how to give it to them without betraying the truth. The film was never made. In Caliente itself, which by the 1970s consisted of a few weathered structures and nothing more, there was a brief effort to restore the town as a tourist attraction. A local historical society raised funds and rebuilt the facade of the old general store, installing a small museum inside with artifacts and photographs from the town's past. The robbery was the centerpiece, of course, the story that gave Caliente its claim to memory. But the museum struggled to draw visitors, and within a decade it had closed again, the building locked and left to the elements. Sarah Calloway's great-niece, a woman named Margaret, who had never lived in Caliente but had grown up hearing stories about it, visited the abandoned museum in 1981. She found the door ajar and went inside, walking through dusty rooms filled with old tools and faded newspapers. She found a photograph of her great-aunt on the wall, standing in front of the general store in what must have been the early 1900s, her face stern, but her eyes kind. Beside the photograph was a handwritten note, placed there by someone in the Historical Society, describing Sarah as the keeper of Caliente's memory. Margaret stood there for a long time, thinking about a woman she'd never met, who had spent decades wondering about three men who had walked through her store and vanished. Margaret took the photograph with her when she left, not stealing but rescuing it from the slow collapse of the building. She had it cleaned and framed and hung it in her home in Sacramento, and when people asked about it, she told them the story. Not the dramatic version, but the quiet one, about a shopkeeper who had extended credit to struggling families, who had worried about the humanity of thieves, who had carried questions she never got to answer. Dr. Hartwell continued her research into the 1980s, expanding her focus to other forgotten crimes and marginalized lives in the Old West. But the Caliente case remained her most personal work. She returned to the desert site several times over the years, always alone, hiking out to the place where the saddlebag had been found. She never found anything new, but that wasn't why she went. She went because the story felt unfinished in a way she couldn't articulate, because she believed that bearing witness mattered even when there was nothing left to witness but absence. In 1984, exactly 102 years after the robbery, she made her last trip to the site. She was in her 60s by then, her knees aching from the hike, and she sat in the shade of the overhang where the saddlebag had rested for 8 decades. She thought about Garrett Cole's final journal entry, about 3 men dying slowly, aware that they had miscalculated but unable to change course. She wondered if they had been angry or resigned, if they had blamed each other or themselves, or simply the indifferent universe. She also thought about Marshal Tom Bridger, riding out alone into the desert year after year, looking for something he couldn't name. About Sarah Calloway, standing at her window in the early morning, thinking about silver coins and men who paid in advance. About Rosa Mendoza, remembering a sad man who had fixed her doll with gentle hands. All these people, touched by a story they couldn't control, carrying it forward even when there was no reason to. That evening, as the sun set and the desert cooled, Dr. Hartwell took out her notebook and wrote a final reflection that would later be published in a journal of Western history. She wrote that the Caliente robbery mattered not because of the crime itself, which was small and ordinary, but because of what it revealed about how people make sense of loss. The town had needed the mystery to mean something, had needed the 3 men to be either heroes or villains, had needed the desert to be either punishing or protective. But the truth was simpler and harder. Sometimes people make desperate choices, and sometimes those choices end badly, and there is no lesson beyond the fact of it. Yet she also wrote that the search for meaning wasn't futile, even when meaning proved elusive. Tom Bridger's rides into the desert, Sarah Calloway's sympathy, Rosa Mendoza's memory of kindness, all of these were acts of witness that affirmed something essential, that lives mattered, even when they ended in failure, even when they were forgotten by history. The act of remembering, of trying to understand, was its own kind of justice. She closed the notebook and sat watching the stars emerge, the same stars that had watched 3 men die a century before, indifferent and eternal. Dr. Hartwell died in 1992. Her work on the Caliente case complete, but never truly finished. Her papers were donated to a university archive, where they remain available to researchers who still occasionally write about the robbery, adding footnotes to a story that refuses to fully close. The site in the desert sees fewer visitors now, the marker weathered and hard to read. But people still come, drawn by the same impulse that drove Tom Bridger into the emptiness, the need to stand in the place where something happened, to let the reality of it settle into the bones. They take photographs and read the brief description and try to imagine what it was like. 3 men and 3 horses, and the slow realization that the map was wrong and the water was gone and there would be no escape. What they find, mostly, is silence. The gold was never recovered. The remains of the 3 men were never identified. The desert kept what it took, as it always does, but the story remains, passed down not as myth now, but as history, a small tragedy in a vast landscape, a reminder that the past is full of people who tried and failed and were forgotten until someone cared enough to remember. In the end, that might be the only truth worth holding. Not what happened to Garrett Cole and William Fairchild and Esteban Ruiz, but that their names are still spoken, that their humanity is still acknowledged, that the questions they left behind still matter to someone. The desert stretches on, endless and patient, holding its secrets beneath the sun. And somewhere in that vastness, beneath sand and stone and the weight of years, 3 men rest in graves that were never marked, their story finally told not by the wind, but by the people who refused to let it be entirely forgotten. That is enough. It has to be. The sun sets over the Mojave, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, and the desert grows quiet again, waiting for whatever comes next.